Hello and welcome. You're listening to the Just Love Them podcast. I'm your host, Shiree Best. Join me on a journey to understand and find peace with those we love who have left their faith. As people share their experiences, their thoughts, and their takeaways on this podcast, listen for what resonates for you and take from these episodes what will help you in your life and for your situation. Today's special guest is Isaac Hess. I had his wife on here recently, a few weeks ago, so we're getting both sides of their story, and I'm really excited Isaac's with me today. Isaac was raised a member of the LDS Church. He served in LDS mission and attended Brigham Young University. In late 2018, after years of spiritual struggle, Isaac left the LDS Church. In 2021, at Easter, he was baptized into the Catholic Church. His wife, Camber, is still LDS, and the two of them navigate a mixed faith marriage. Isaac works as a software engineer and in his spare time enjoys the outdoors, reading, watching baseball, and playing with his kids. Isaac's been married to his wife, Camber, for nearly 18 years. They are the parents of 5 children. Welcome, Isaac.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. I haven't ever had a chance to interview both a husband and a wife in one of these situations, and I'm so grateful you're willing to come on and share your perspective.
Yeah, no problem. I'm very glad you interviewed my wife first so I can be sure to not contradict anything that she said because her version of events is always the accurate one.
As any good husband would say, right?
That's right. That's right.
I would love for you to start out by sharing a little bit of what happened when you chose to walk away, what led up to that. A lot of my listeners don't understand people who have made a different choice, and I would love to have kind of your perspective on that situation for you and what your story was with that.
Sure. So I was, as you mentioned in the introduction, I was raised in the LDS church with great family, wonderful parents. We had a big family. By the time I'm one of the older kids, so by the time I reached kind of the end of high school, there were 8 kids in the family. And it was just a great upbringing. You know, we did all the very kind of LDS things you would imagine. We had a family home evening every week. We would do scripture study every morning. We were a very musical family. Both my parents sang in the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. And so a lot of our childhood growing up involved singing hymns and primary songs and doing musical numbers. And it just was the church was kind of the reality that permeated everything we did as a family. And I loved it. I had a wonderful experience growing up a member of the LDS faith, and really just didn't have anything negative. You know, there's no, I wasn't. I know some people who end up leaving often will kind of either throughout their upbringing or looking back kind of identify difficult things, things that were hard for them. But for me, it just worked. It was great. So I served a mission, as you also mentioned. Came back, went to BYU. That's where I met my wonderful wife, and we got married in 2006. It was a few years after we were married that I began to study both LDS history and broader Christian history more deeply. Mostly it was just out of my own intellectual curiosity. I'm a reader. I like to study history. I like to study philosophy. I like to think about things, you know? So it was around that time that Rough Stone Rolling, there's a book by an LDS historian, Richard Bushman, came out in, I think, 2005 or 4, somewhere around there. So just a few years after that, I started reading that. It was a biography of Joseph Smith. And this was also, you know, the early days of the internet and more information being really widely available. So I started to study LDS church history in ways that I had never had opportunity to do so before. A lot of what I read was really difficult for me and really kind of shook a lot of my beliefs and made me kind of reevaluate a lot of things. And so for about a long period of time, you know, I don't know, maybe 8 years or something, maybe up to a decade, I kind of was in a phase of spiritual turmoil, I guess is what I would put it. I loved being LDS, and it was a huge part of my identity. But I had a really hard time reconciling my faith with things that I was learning, et cetera. That, it's not an uncommon story for a lot of different people exploring their own faith tradition that they grew up in. In previous times when I've told the story, I've described it as kind of a yo-yo type experience. I had my ups, I had my downs. I'd kind of go up and feel really good about things for a while and then be down and really be spiritually struggling for quite some time. This was really hard because I've always really had, I think, a very deep and abiding faith in Jesus. And what I wanted more than anything else in my life was just to be a disciple, just to follow him, believe in him. The more time passed, the more that was becoming a struggle for me to do in the LDS faith because I just had my own nagging suspicions that it wasn't true. And during this time, I would every now and then kind of mention something here or there to my wife, but she kind of made it pretty obvious that she wasn't interested in discussing anything that maybe could be like negative about the LDS faith. And we had a wonderful, wonderful marriage, still do. We have a wonderful marriage. And so when you have a marriage where conflict is very, very low, it's very hard to introduce something into the marriage that brings conflict. Even if it's something that maybe is necessary to discuss because it's becoming such an issue for one of the spouses. So I kind of buried this for a very long time. And there's so many things that could be said. I know that this is not meant to be a long discursive exploration of my faith journey, but we had many things that occurred during this time. We had our first children. We lost a child shortly after she was born. Just lots of different things. Toward the end of this 8-year period or so, around 2018, I kind of reached a point where it kind of felt like a breaking point to me, right? I just reached a point where I thought, I can't live my spiritual life like this for the rest of my life. I have to resolve my concerns in one direction or the other. So in late 2018, I sat down with my wife, Camber, and she knew I had struggles with my faith and that sort of thing. But I kind of told her I have to make a definitive effort to really figure out what I think is true and commit myself to following that, whatever it is. So I can't dally about this, bounce around like this anymore. I've got to do it. And I mentioned I had also for this past several years before this been studying just Christian history in general. So I'd been doing a lot of reading of early Christians, people that are often referred to as like the early church fathers, early Christian writers, and just trying to understand what this experience of Christianity was kind of from the beginning and how it took shape and how it resulted in kind of the religious landscape that we see today, right? With so many different faiths and that sort of thing. And so I told my wife in the end of 2018 that I needed to take a step back from the LDS church and spend some time exploring other churches. And that's what I did. So for the next several years, I went on this. It's hard to put it into words. I could call it a whirlwind. I could call it an exciting exploration. There's no one phrase that captures the multiplicity of experience and feeling that went on in these next few years as I explored other Christian faiths, I began to study very deeply the history of the LDS faith. I just read lots and lots of different books, both from LDS perspective and non-LDS perspectives, current believing members, former members, that sort of thing. Just wanted to get a very holistic picture as best I could, and also was studying Christian history. And after a little time of doing that, I decided to resign my membership from the LDS Church. But I was still very much committed at that time, still am now, to follow Christ. That was my goal. The thing that animated my search was, where's Jesus? That's where I want to be. Where he is, that's where I want to make my home. And so after several more years of searching, praying, learning, I was baptized into the Catholic Church at Easter in 2021. So it's been about 3.5 years now that I've been in the Catholic faith. That's kind of a rough sketch of the journey that I've been on.
So I would love to know, I'm sure that as you made this transition into exploration instead of just being in the church that you and your wife are in together, as you made that transition into exploring and then into joining another church, I'm sure that there were constant pivot points that you and your wife both had to do in order to keep your relationship strong and good between you. And I would be very interested to know anything that you did that helped, anything that you did that kept your marriage strong. How did you navigate that?
I didn't always navigate it well. I think Camber would probably say the same. I don't think I'm betraying anything by saying that we both feel like, there were times when it was when we didn't navigate it with the kind of grace that we would want to.
And sometimes it's helpful to know what you didn't do well that you wish you could go back and change, and as well as things that you did do well. So any insight that you have on
Yeah.
either side of that would be really helpful.
Well, we had kind of the classic double problem where that many, especially within the LDS tradition, when someone's leaving the LDS faith, run into you're sort of learning new things and exploring new things. You really, really want to talk about it. And so there's always a temptation to overload someone with information. I definitely fell into that many times.
Hmm.
On the converse side, there's also the desire often of the believing spouse to not, they don't want to hear it, right? So you run into this really kind of difficult and sometimes fatal to a marriage situation where you need to communicate, you need to connect. And this is the thing for me, this was the thing that was happening in my life, right? But I couldn't talk to my wife about it. And
Mm,
that was very painful. That was very hard because before this, we had been able to talk easily and openly about basically anything. There was no taboo topic between us. If we had mild disagreements with each other, we just could talk them through relatively easily. We didn't have any of these major struggles, which in some ways is wonderful, but also didn't prepare us for hitting this situation because we had never learned up to that point in our marriage how to handle like a real conflict when we really disagreed about something. What do we do? Right. I think that a lot of people probably will be familiar with that kind of struggle in a relationship, someone really wanting to talk about it, wanting to share. Like from my perspective, I wanted to share, I wanted to open my heart to her and say, like, this is what I'm learning, this is what I'm thinking about, this is what I'm experiencing. But that was something that was too painful for her to handle.
yeah.
Right.
And that's really
So
hard when you're used to sharing everything, both of you, about everything with each other, to then have a topic where, especially it sounds like you were really excited to share, and it was really painful for her to listen. That would cause a really big wedge.
yes. Yeah, it was hard. So for some time, it was just kind of difficult. But I think, I'm not trying to end it on a negative note. I'm trying to kind of start it on these are some of the mistakes that I think we made. And maybe they can't even class them as mistakes. Some in some ways these are just inevitable things to grow through, right? Kind
Yes.
of you have to get through this phase. It's not really a mistake to say that I wanted to share these things, but she couldn't really wasn't in a place to kind of like hear them
Yeah.
and listen. It was just kind of a painful time. And I know when my wife was on, she talked about grief and how people are familiar if you lose a loved one, there's kind of stages of grief that you go through. And it was very natural. Everyone would understand if someone were to say, I just can't talk about this right now, right? Or whatever. Different people
Yes.
process grief in different ways. And we were both going through grief. It was leaving the LDS church was also extremely difficult for me. Well, it was also exciting and spiritually uplifting in at times where I felt a sense of peace and profundity, maybe, in the things I was learning and new doctrines I was experiencing and traditions that I was adopting that really, really seemed rooted to me in the Christian faith. And these were like beautiful things for me, but it was also extremely painful to leave something familiar, to disrupt the life of my family. Like these were things that I didn't take lightly, right?
Right.
So it's painful as well. I think one of the main, this will sound maybe so simplistic, I don't know, but my wife and I both just throughout this entire experience had just a solid sense of commitment to our marriage and to our family. I don't think that either of us ever once questioned whether that commitment was still there from our own perspective. There maybe were times where, maybe she was a little worried about me. um, but I never, so this allowed us, I think, especially, and allowed me to kind of work through these things with a kind of patience. Well, thinking to myself, we'll get through this, right? We might go through a difficult time, but we will get through this. And because our marriage and our family, this is our calling, this is our vocation in our life. And, it's not something that that we felt like was optional. And that kind of gives us the motivation and the patience to kind of get there to the point where you can get through that grieving phase, through some of that difficulty, and find new ways of communicating, new ways of connecting, and that sort of thing.
I think that what you shared is really important to have that solid sense of commitment, because if you don't have that, then it's almost like you've got like the back doors open or one foot's out. To go through anything hard, especially in a marriage relationship, to have that solid sense of commitment that we are going to stay together no matter what, we can figure this out. We will figure this out. We are going to get through this together. I think that kind of an attitude makes a huge difference.
Yeah. So another thing that we've done is we've done marriage counseling, which has been really helpful, both in terms of helping us learn to communicate around these areas that were so difficult for us to talk about. Learn just like some basic strategies around that. And that was huge. But also recognizing, this is something that we kind of discussed in marriage counseling. It was very easy for us in our early marriage to equate unity with sameness, because we were very similar. We agreed, so in your mind, you kind of start to think, and I think there is somewhat to a degree in which we're kind of raised to think this way. To be united means to agree. There is some truth to that. If we disagreed about everything, it would be very hard to be united. And so one of the things that we learned to do was to focus on the things that we still have in common, which in our case, especially since I'm Christian and I'm Catholic, there are a lot of things that we still have very much in common in terms of religious beliefs, moral beliefs, that sort of thing. So, but even if, say, I had left for some kind of atheism, then there are still things I think that any couple, especially if you have an established relationship, can find that you still hold very much in common and that you really respect about one another. And those can be anchor points. When you disagree, you can go back to those common things. So maybe maybe we do have a disagreement about how something should occur or what we should do, but we both agree on this sort of deeper principle or this deeper belief. And because of that, how can we come up with a united decision about how we're going to move forward, even if it's a compromise, right? A compromise decision or a mixture of the two, right? Like, oh, sometimes the kids will come to church with me, sometimes they'll go to church with her, those types of things. So marriage counseling was really helpful for us.
Yeah, I would imagine
really
it did
nice
help
thing.
you navigate through all of that and figure out some of those logistics, like who's going to go to church with who and how do we compromise on this? I'm a big proponent of counseling. I think it can help us have tools that we wouldn't know otherwise.
Yeah. We also, in the case of like leaving the LDS faith too, I mean, maybe this is, I'm obviously not as familiar with people who maybe leave other faiths, but there's also lifestyle differences that end up coming up, right? So like,
Yeah.
there's a lot of really basic, you think about what like the word of wisdom, how LDS people abstain from coffee, tea, tobacco, alcohol, that sort of thing, which is kind of an LDS distinctive, right? And so in becoming Catholic, some of these things become open to me, but this is something that is difficult to navigate in our marriage, right? Because this is, never before have I wanted to have a cup of coffee in the morning, but now I do. Never before have I wanted to just go out and have a beer with a friend on a Friday night. And now that sounds like something that would be nice, right? How do you navigate those kinds of things? And that was hard. And I think for things like that, really just patience and time was the thing that helped us, both, and a sense of mutual respect. I never wanted to do anything that made her made her uncomfortable or made her, I was always very open in talking to her about these types of things. I'm thinking about doing this. What would you think? How would you feel about that? There were times when I just thought, that's fine. I just won't do that for now. I'll wait. And there was a chapter in the Epistle of Romans where Paul, in Romans chapter 14, where he specifically talks about eating and drinking. And I kind of adopted this as my motto, right? He says, Romans 14:15, he says, if your brother is grieved by what you eat, You are no longer walking in love. By what you eat, do not destroy the one for whom Christ died. And when you are kind of navigating differences of opinion about these types of things, and maybe this is just a again maybe simplistic sounding thing, but I think is useful in navigating these differences is just make love the guiding principle of what you're trying to do. Obviously, I don't know how much of your audience is people who have left their faith tradition, but I would definitely counsel anyone who's leaving a faith tradition to just be patient and loving toward a spouse who is still in the old faith tradition, and just make that your guiding star. If you're thinking of doing something, yes, there's the question of, well, what do I want to do? But if that's your only guide, I mean, that's not typically how people make a successful marriage, even when they're before a change. If you just think, what do I want to do?
Hmm.
You're going to really struggle in your marriage. Maybe what you want to do changes somewhat after a faith transition, but it still can't be the determining factor. And then, of course, from the perspective of the spouse who's still a believer, you do need to be, I would say, considerate of the changing desires of the person who's navigating into a different faith tradition or to no faith tradition at all. I don't think it's tenable to sort of say nothing will ever change, right?
Yeah,
We're never going to change anything in the way that we live. That just is not going to work. But with patience and time and love, I think that most couples can come to kind of an understanding of how to incorporate changes in behavior and life in ways that keep the marriage strong and respectful.
I would agree. And I think you've given us some real gems. Making love the guiding principle. I think that that is such in any relationship, not just a marriage relationship, but any relationship that you care about, whether it's a parent-child or siblings or, whatever it is, to making love that guiding principle is so key because then you become unselfish rather than what you're describing. If you were to say, oh, well, what do I want to do? There's got to be some give and take, of course, like what you described, but I think that that is such a gem. And also to use patience, time, and love. Sometimes time really is what it takes in order to have things just work out. Sometimes you just need to give it some time for it to meld together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
As a concrete example, the first time I asked my wife what she would think if I made coffee at home, right? She was not ready for that because, growing up in an LDS household, even something as simple as a coffee maker on a countertop can kind of stick out like a sore thumb.
Yeah.
And can be, and especially in our context, it's a symbol, it's an even deeper symbol of a sort of change that the believing spouse never wanted, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And it's a sort of daily reminder, right? The smell and the presence and all that, something that you might not think about if you just go to your workplace and people are drinking coffee, but it's different when it's on your own kitchen countertop when you come downstairs in the morning. And that made, I would be lying if I was saying that I never felt any frustration or anything like that or impatience. I'm not a perfect person. There were plenty of times where I wanted to hurry things along more to my liking. I'm
Hmm.
human like anyone else. But I also I tried to remind myself that, these things take time and patience, and we both have to go through this adjustment process. And then eventually we arrived at a point where my wife said, that's fine. It doesn't mean that she loved it. She wasn't thinking, hooray, right? I
Yeah.
absolutely love the smell of this or whatever. She hates the smell of coffee. But we got to a point where she said, that's fine, right? Like, I understand this is something that you want to do, and that's fine. Go for it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that in terms of trying to keep a relationship strong, what we want, I think what most people want in a marriage is a sense of intimacy, a sense of closeness between spouses. But intimacy doesn't always, sometimes it can spring from a sense of agreement, right? When you find someone who is of the exact same mind as you about something, that can be an amazing thing to really
Yes.
connect with someone at that level. But even I have very, very intimate friends that disagree with me on almost everything that I believe. But the reason that we're close is because we can share with each other what we think, listen respectfully. We really enjoy bouncing ideas off each other, even though we completely disagree. And I think even in a marriage, there's many ways to achieve a kind of intimacy, a sense of safety, a sense that like, this is my person that I am sharing my life with, even if in the morning I'm drinking a cup of coffee and she isn't, right?
Yeah.
There can be this real sense of closeness. Or if I have a concern, we're much better about now understanding each other's boundaries and when is it a good time for me to bring up things I want to talk about? When is a good time for her to bring things? How do we have those conversations so they don't become confrontational? How do we know when we're done?
Yeah.
When it's become too much and it just needs to stop and we need to go to bed and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And do you have any advice to share about how to bring up those kinds of conversations with people?
I always like to just be really direct. I usually just like to say, I have something that I want to talk to you about related to church stuff or something like that. Is now an okay time to discuss it? That reduces all the ambiguity of what you want to talk about and allows my wife to say something like, "Sure, let's chat," or "No, I'm too tired. It's late at night, or I've had a terrible day with the kids, and maybe we're both just exhausted, and we'll just say, let's just talk about it tomorrow." And say, "All
Yeah.
right, that's fine."
I love the respect in that because, especially with the question, is now a good time to talk about that? Because if the person's ready, great. And if they're not ready, it not only allows for that, but it also gives them some time to kind of gear up to know that there's going to be a conversation that they might need to be emotionally ready for.
Yep.
Well, Isaac, talking to you today has been so insightful for me. All the things that you've shared, they not only transcend a marriage relationship, but so much farther out too. They vibrate even out to other relationships, and they're just so many gems in what you've shared today. I'm so grateful that you were willing to come on and share your story and your perspective. I think everybody thinks a little differently, and we can learn from each other. To be able to understand another person leads so much into being able to accept and love them where they are. And I'm so grateful you were willing to share all of that with us today.
Thank you for having me on.
You're welcome. And for my listeners, who do you know that could use the support that we are talking about in trying to navigate their loved ones leaving their faith? Please do them a favor and share this podcast episode with them. Also, if you haven't joined the private Facebook group, it was created for you as a place to ask questions, to get and give support, and to connect with others who are going through similar experiences that you are. And as always, please join me again next time for another episode of Just Love Them.